Hello and welcome to COLREGS In Depth. Today we're going to be taking a look at Rule 12, sailing vessels. Now before we even start, what is a sailing vessel? Fortunately we've got Rule 3 which provides definitions, including a definition of a sailing vessel. You see that a sailing vessel means any vessel under sail, provided that propelling machinery, if fitted, is not being used. So this means practically any vessel could be classed as a sailing vessel if they had a mast up and were sailing. Even if they've got an engine fitted, as long as they're not using it, they're classed as a sailing vessel. So, into Rule 12 itself. Where does this actually apply? Well, Rule 12 fits in Part B, Section 2 of the COLREGS, which is called Conduct of Vessels in Sight of One Another. In fact, Rule 11 specifically states that rules in this section apply to vessels in sight of one another. But what does that mean? Again, Rule 3 provides the answer. Vessels are deemed to be in sight of one another only when one can be observed visually from the other. So this means Rule 12 applies when two vessels can see each other. So into the rule itself, the first section. When two sailing vessels are approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision, one of them shall keep out of the way of the other as follows. This sentence actually carries a lot of meaning. There's three specific parts to it. The first bit says that it applies when two sailing vessels are approaching one another. So it doesn't apply if one of them's a motor vessel, it doesn't apply if one's a fishing vessel, it will only apply if both the vessels are sailing vessels. It also says they've got to be approaching so as to involve risk of collision. This means you cannot apply Rule 12 if risk of collision does not exist. So if you're in a race or in any other situation where you're just wanting somebody to keep out of your way, unless risk of collision actually exists, Rule 12 cannot apply. And then the final part, one of them shall keep out of the way of the other as follows, implies that it's going to define a stand-on vessel and a give-way vessel. Obviously defining these two different ones places an obligation onto both vessels, one as a stand-on and one as a give-way. Other rules specifically define the action that these have got to take. So how does it define them? Well, the first part of that definition. When each has the wind on a different side, the vessel which has the wind on the port side shall keep out of the way of the other. This situation is actually the simplest one. Each have the wind on a different side means there's an easy way to tell them apart. So let's dive straight into a diagram and have a look at this part in action. Okay, so in our diagram we're going to take the wind to be at the top of the screen. We're going to put ourselves on this blue sailing vessel. We've got the wind on our port side. You can see the sail hanging over the starboard side of the boat. We're sailing along quite happily. No other vessels, no risk of collision. We've got no reason to change our course or speed or do anything different. But suddenly we see another vessel. We can see they've got a sail up and no indication of them using their engine. So we can tell from this situation that there's two sailing vessels. And that's pretty much it. We've got to determine if risk of collision exists. The only way to do that is by continuing to monitor the situation. So we monitor for a little bit. We can't really tell much from that, so we have to monitor a little bit more. By now we can see that her bearing isn't really changing. We now know risk of collision exists. We can see that she's a sailing vessel, so we know we've got two sailing vessels, and we know we can see each other, so Rule 12 is going to apply. Being able to see her, we can see she's got the wind on her starboard side. Her sail is hanging over the port side of the vessel. So we've both got the wind on a different side. The vessel with the wind on her port side, which is us on the blue vessel, we must keep out of the way. So in this situation, the easiest thing to do is just going to be to come round to starboard, make a bold alteration of course so that the other vessel can see what we're doing, and then we can continue past. And we continue past until we're finally past and clear. You don't have to alter course to starboard, it's just in this situation that's probably the easiest thing to do. Okay, so we've now said that when we've got the wind on a different side we're very easy to tell apart, and the rule simply says whoever's got the wind on the port side needs to keep out of the way. So the one with the wind on the port side is the give-way vessel, the one with the wind on the starboard side would be the stand-on vessel. But in the next part, if you've both got the wind on the same side, you can't tell yourselves apart in that particular way. So when you have the wind on the same side, you're now defining your responsibilities in terms of where the wind is coming from. The vessel which is to windward needs to keep out of the way of the vessel which is to leeward. The windward vessel is simply the one closest to the source of the wind. The one to leeward is downwind of the other vessel. It's easy to think of sort of like the leeward side of an island is the one that's sheltered from the wind. The leeward vessel is effectively sheltered from the wind by the windward vessel. So actually this is quite simple to understand. The one to windward is in the clean air. They'll find it a lot easier to manoeuvre than the vessel which is to leeward. But let's have a look at this in a diagram anyway. In this diagram again, we're going to take the wind to be coming from the north of the screen. So we'll put the wind arrow at the top. We're going to place ourselves on the small vessel at the bottom. We're on the blue vessel this time again. You can see the sail is hanging across the port side of our vessel. The wind is on our starboard side. So we're sailing along quite happily. Nobody else around, so we can continue quite easily. But we then see another vessel. We can make out she's a sailing vessel. We can see her sails up. We can even make out that she's got the wind on the starboard side. We can see that the sail is hanging over the port side of her, and we know from our position that the wind is coming from the north, so it would be pretty hard for her to have the wind coming from the other side. But in this situation, we haven't determined if risk of collision exists. The only way to do that is to continue to monitor the situation. After a little while, we've seen that the bearing between us isn't changing. We know risk of collision exists. So, what are we going to do? Well, under Rule 12, we know we've got two sailing vessels, risk of collision exists, Rule 12 applies. We know we've both got the wind on the same side, so the vessel which is to windward needs to keep out of the way. In this case, the red vessel is the give-way vessel, and the blue vessel is the stand-on vessel. So the red one is going to make a bold alteration of course. We can see her coming round, we can see she's taken action. And we can continue, and she's going to pass clear astern of us. Again, she could have taken any action. She could have stopped in the water, she could have come round to starboard, or she could come round to port. And once she's clear, then we just continue on till we're finally passed in clear and no risk of collision exists. So part 2 here simply says the vessel to windward keeps out of the way of the vessel to leeward. Makes complete sense. Further upwind, clean air, they find it easier to manoeuvre. In part 3 though, this starts to define a specific situation, kind of combining the previous two. If you're a vessel and you've got the wind on the port side, and you see a vessel to windward, and you cannot determine with certainty whether that vessel has the wind on her port or her starboard side, you need to keep out of her way. So, the easiest way to explain this is in a diagram again. Okay, in this diagram we're going to take the wind again from the north, and we're going to place ourselves in a vessel down here in the bottom left hand corner. This is pretty much the same as in the first example. We've got the wind on our port side, sailing along quite happily, nobody else, so we can continue. However, we then see another vessel up ahead. We can tell they're a sailing vessel, we can see they've got their sails up, but they've got a lot of sails up here, and we know that the wind is coming from astern of them, so we haven't really got much of an idea as to which side she's got her wind. We've got to determine, first of all, whether risk of collision exists. So we'll continue to monitor the situation. We can see the compass bearing hasn't appreciably changed, so we know risk of collision exists. But we've now got to determine our action. We know that Rule 12 applies because we're both sailing vessels, and we can see each other, and risk of collision exists. So Rule 12 is going to designate one of us as stand-on and one of us as give-way. We're sat on this red vessel. We're now thinking, if she's got the wind on her port side, that means we've got the wind on the same side, and she's to windward, so she's got to keep out of our way. And then we're thinking, hang on, what if she's got the wind on the other side? If she's got the wind on her starboard side, then I've got to now keep out of her way. And this is when the third part kicks in. We've got the wind on our port side, we see a vessel to windward, we cannot determine with certainty, so we've got to keep out of her way. In this situation, she's actually got the wind on the starboard side, so she knows full well that she has right of way. We haven't quite determined that, but under the third part we cannot determine things with certainty, so we've got to keep out of her way. This time we're going to make a bold alteration to starboard and continue till we're finally passed and clear, and then we can continue on our way knowing risk of collision does not exist. So in part 3 of the rule we've seen that a vessel with the wind on her port side, if she cannot determine with certainty whether she's the stand on or give way vessel, she needs to assume that she's the give way and keep out of the way of the other vessel. But how do you actually determine on which side the windward side is? We've got part B of the rule to tell us that. And this states, for the purposes of this rule, the windward side shall be deemed to be the side opposite to that on which the mainsail is carried, or in the case of a square-rigged vessel, the side opposite to that on which the largest fore and aft sail is carried. So it's basically saying that we're going to define the windward side, but only for the purposes of this rule. It's very easy once you actually see what the mainsail is, or what a largest fore and aft sail is. Let's have a look at some pictures to see for certain. Okay, so in this first picture we can see we've got a simple yacht. She's got one sail up. It just so happens she's got the mainsail up. We know that because here we have the main mast, and here we have the main sail. It's hanging off the mainmast, it's actually on the boom. To determine the windward side, we need to determine which side she's carrying this sail. It's actually quite hard from this angle to determine. The only thing we'd be able to go on would be that possibly this flag astern telling us the wind direction, and actually because it's right in the centre of the ship, it's very hard to tell. Let's have a look at the next image. Okay, so this image is a bit more of a classic yacht. We've got two different sails. We've got this forward sail here, but for the purposes of the rule, this sail has no impact at all. We are interested in the one astern of her mast, this one here. This is her mainsail, and we need to try and work out on what side it's carried. To me it looks like she's carrying the mainsail on her port side, which means the wind is coming from her starboard side. You can tell just by looking at these images it's actually very hard to tell where the wind is coming from. Let's try the next one. Okay, so in this picture we're starting to look at some square rigged sails. You've got these sails here on the mast, which are the square rigged ones. These are not to be used for trying to work out what side the wind is from. They're a very good indication, but as per the rule they don't define which is her windward side. We're looking for the largest fore and aft sail. These sails are running in a fore and aft direction. This sail in here is also running in a fore and aft direction, and this sail at the stern is running in a fore and aft direction. To me, this one looks like the largest one, so we're going to use that to determine on which side the windward side is. From this picture, it looks like that sail is hanging over the starboard side of her vessel, so that means she has the wind on her port side. This actually ties in with all the other sails, but we're having to use the largest fore and aft sail to actually determine it. Let's have a look at the next picture. Okay, so this picture is a much larger square-rigged vessel. You can see she's got loads of large square sails on each and every mast, which, unfortunately, for the purposes of the rule, we cannot use to determine on which side she's carrying the wind. We know just by looking at it they're a brilliant indication, and they're actually showing that the wind's on the port side, but we can't use that according to the rule. We're looking at the combination of all the fore and aft sails in all the positions, trying to work out which one is the largest one to determine on which side the wind is. Luckily, all the sails are hanging over the starboard side, including this one, which to me looks like the largest fore and aft sail, so we know she's got the wind on her port side. All the sails are hanging over the starboard side, wind on the port side. Let's have a look at one final picture. Okay, so in this picture, again we've got loads of square rigs on all three of the big masts, but we know we cannot use those to determine on what side she's carrying the wind. We need the largest fore and aft sail, which is probably going to be this one at the stern here. It's very hard to tell because of the angle we're looking at it. We know that all the fore and aft sails are hanging across the port side of the ship. So, sails across the port side means she's got the wind coming from her starboard side. Looking at all the square sails, they're actually tying in with this. They're clearly showing she's got the wind on her starboard side. However, we're not allowed to use those for the purposes of the rule, but they do confirm what we thought from the fore and aft sails. And so that completes part B, which has basically just defined which side the windward side shall be in the case of normal yachts that are carrying just a mainsail, and square rigged vessels which have loads of sails. It shows you which one you have to use to determine where the wind is coming from. And that also completes the whole of Rule 12. We've seen it applies to sailing vessels, so if you've got a power-driven vessel in the mix, this rule simply does not apply. And it applies when risk of collision exists, which makes sense because you're trying to avoid collisions. The whole purpose of all of these rules is to prevent collisions at sea. Next time we'll be just moving on to one of the other rules. I hope you found this information useful. Until next time, goodbye.